Rancho Cucamonga, California, a sun-soaked suburb about 40 miles east of Los Angeles. It's the late 1980s, and a young New Yorker named Deborah, well, she just moved cross-country to begin her life with her new husband, Bill Moffat Jr. Now, by all accounts, Deborah, she was excited about the future. She had been exchanging VHS tapes of wrestling matches with Bill long before she even stepped foot on Archibald Avenue, a 10-mile street that would soon earn an unsettling reputation for the Moffat family. But what Deborah didn't know was that this seemingly quiet neighborhood would begin to become the center of something far stranger and more disturbing than anyone could have ever imagined. Now, Deborah found herself in a very unique living arrangement. See, there was 3 houses, all neatly beside each other. The first house, it belonged to Bill's late grandmother, Dominica. That was until her passing. The second home, it was just right next door, and it belonged to Bill's parents, Bill Sr. and Lena, whom everyone just called Lee. And the third house, it belonged to Bill Jr. himself, inherited from his aunt, who had just recently passed away. But rather than living in the house that he owned, Bill Jr. chose to stay with his parents. He suffered from a very serious heart condition, and being close to family felt like a safety net in the events of any kind of health scare. So when Deborah married Bill Jr., she moved in under his parents' roof. Now, it might not be everyone's idea of the perfect newlywed setup, but Deborah, she embraced it. 3 houses, they stand side by side, and a family all together should have brought some form of comfort and security, yet somehow became a backdrop for a growing sense of unease. In today's episode, we'll uncover just what Deborah discovered about Bill's grandmother and why, even in death, Dominica still seemed to cast a long shadow on the Moffat family. Now, according to Bill Jr., Dominica, she suffered from a stroke just a few years earlier. Now, while she pulled through, her recovery, it was rocky at best. See, she needed help around the clock. The Moffats, they found what they thought was a perfect solution. A Guatemalan immigrant named Wanita, who came very highly recommended as a caregiver. She moved into Dominica's home to provide constant support through the last years of Dominica's life. But no matter how devoted Wanita was to caring for her, Dominica's health, it never fully returned. Eventually, she was taken to the hospital. She would pass away. Now, Wanita was worried about her own immigration status. I mean, losing a patient, that meant losing a steady job. So she would stay on for just a little while, just to help pack up and prepare the house for the family. Then one night, everything changed. Bill Jr.'s mother, Lee, was jolted awake by a panicked phone call from Wanita. She was next door, screaming for help. Alarmed, Bill Jr. and his father, Bill Sr., rushed into the darkness. As they approached Dominica's house, they saw Wanita bursting through the front door, running into the street in absolute terror. Behind her, Bill Jr. claimed that he saw a glowing ball of light. Many of us would call that an orb, but it seemed to chase Wanita right out of the house before vanishing right into thin air. Now trembling, Wanita, she begged and pleaded to stay in the middle house. While she was staying there with the Moffat family, she could barely speak through her sobs. Over and over again, she would plead, "I'm sorry. I was only trying to help." Now, in the early hours of that same night, a relative came to pick up Wanita. But before she left, she gave a very stern warning. She said, never step foot in Dominica's house again. You see, something cruel and malevolent now resides there. And to Lee in particular, Wanita gave a very grave warning. She said, especially you. There's evil there. See, this was a very chilling message. One that left Lee, a devoutly religious woman, deeply unsettled. She believed in supernatural forces, of course, but this was more direct and personal than anything that she could have ever imagined. Had something truly malevolent moved into Dominica's old house? And if so, how did Wanita provoke it? And why was Lee, above all others, warned to stay away? Now, for the Moffat family, the days that followed Dominica's death was filled with grief and obviously the practicalities of sorting out her estate. See, the corner house on Archibald Avenue, it had been cleaned, the rooms emptied, and its doors readied for new tenants. But when Bill Jr.'s mother, Lee, went inside to begin the work, she made a discovery that would cast an even darker shadow on the very property. Amongst the boxes and the leftover belongings, Lee stumbled across what appeared to be possibly things used for a ritual. See, there was traces of blood and feathers and melted candle wax, broken rosary beads, and cryptic symbols on the floor. Shocked, Lee instantly suspected that Wanita was possibly in her last hours with Dominica. She believed that maybe she turned to her faith. She was hoping to use that to improve Dominica's health. Santeria. It combines Western African belief with Roman Catholic tradition and involves the worship of deities known as Retraced. In some cases, animal sacrifices are performed as a means of ritual, devotion, or possibly for healing. Now, for Lee, a devout Christian, the discovery of blood and broken religious items felt like a direct threat to everything she believed in. Had these sacrifices somehow opened a doorway to evil, as Wanita herself had warned on the very night that she fled from the house? For Lee, this was a terrifying sign that something sinister had taken root in Dominica's house. To her in her heart, she felt as though all the pieces of the puzzle, they were fitting perfectly together. You got Wanita, who has this midnight terror, some would say, the orb of light that seemed to chase her outside the house to the street, and then her dire warning to never step inside that home ever again. By 1987, life on Archibald Avenue had started moving forward. The grief over the passing of Dominica had given way to somewhat of a life coming back to the Moffat family. Deborah had moved in with her husband, Bill Jr., who was living with his parents. And the corner house, Dominica's house, it was being rented out to a local man. But the Moffats, they were about to learn that strange happenings, they're not always limited to just one address. Now, as tenants came and went, Bill Jr. started getting some very weird questions from the tenant that was staying at Dominica's former house. Questions about whether someone had died there or the casual use of a Ouija board. Now, despite these unusual inquiries, nothing super scary seemed to happen on that property. At least, not yet. Now, we've been doing a lot of talking about the two houses. Truth be told, it's Bill Jr.'s house, the third house, that's probably the most interesting at this part in time in the story. Now, this house was also being rented out, and Bill had his favorite treasure there. Now, as part of the agreement, he had an extensive sports memorabilia collection. Now, we're talking about baseball cards and medals and jerseys. He also had a group of bobblehead dolls, which was very carefully displayed on a locked shelf. Now, in his lease agreement with the tenants, Bill could drop by at any point in time to check on his beloved collection. It's kind of part of the deal. Now, with that said, what Bill Jr. didn't expect was to one day unlock the door and find the bobblehead dolls all removed from the shelf and arranged on the floor. Now, the figurines, they formed a very interesting shape. It was that of a triangle with a tail kind of trailing off of the edge, almost like a kite to a degree. Now, when Bill confronted the tenants, the man insisted he hadn't been anywhere near the collection, and he had no key to get inside of it. So for now, Bill just kind of let it slide, but he and Deborah agreed to keep a very close watch on the collection going forward. Now, within a week, the tenant's discomfort turned into almost like an anxiety. He refused to share any kind of details, but he abruptly packed up, and he left just as mysteriously as he had arrived. Now, this wasn't the first time this happened. It had happened quite often, to be honest, and it somewhat annoyed and perplexed Deborah and Bill. So they began the process of preparing the house for whoever was going to move in next. So they went to the house and they began to clean. In fact, in the living room, Deborah noticed this long shelf lined with these little dog figurines. She turned away for what she described as only a split second, enough time to go get a cloth or to get a duster. But when she looked back, every single dog figurine on the shelf, it had been flipped around and now was facing the opposite direction. It was one thing to discover the bobbleheads on the floor or to hear tenants muttering about feeling uneasy, but Deborah's experience, it challenged the logic, the thought process that you can just turn around for 1 minute and grab something, and when you turn back around, have something be completely different. How could a shelf full of figurines rotate 180 degrees in just the blink of an eye? Strange activity had begun brewing in the house of Bill Jr., the one that he owned on Archibald Avenue. At first, Deborah chalked it up as her own mistakes. Maybe she was simply misremembering how those ornaments was on the shelves. Now Bill, he suspected a prank by the tenant who had abruptly left with no warning. But the unsettling truth, it soon demanded their attention. While Deborah was cleaning one day, she discovered items that was moving from room to room. A lamp that should be in the bedroom was now mysteriously on the living room floor. And when she would tell Bill about it, he began to wonder if it might be the ghost of his uncle, who had passed away in the very house, an unseen spirit trying to communicate with them. Now, Deborah and Bill Jr., they decided to test this playful presence. They spoke aloud, challenging it to move an object right in front of them, right in front of their very eyes. They wanted to see it themselves. And at first, nothing happened. Now, for Deborah, these early episodes, they felt almost more playful than threatening, almost as though it was like a friendly presence that was possibly showing off or simply trying to get somebody's attention. In fact, she told her friends, she said it just felt mischievous, even harmless. But whether it was Bill's late uncle or something else entirely, the events, they were far from over. Now, before long, the unexplainable activity, it would escalate, drifting beyond the walls of Bill's rental home and seeping right into the houses right next door. In fact, the strange events, they would multiply in very weird ways. First, there was small objects that was appearing between the three homes. We're talking about things like socks and jewelry. They would turn up in the Moffat home, the middle house, when they should have been in one of the other two homes. So it wasn't just staying to just one home. In fact, one day Lee, again, you got to remember, she was deeply religious. She found men's underwear draped across a statue of Jesus in her personal praying area. If that's not a mockery, I don't know what is. Before long, they realized these items, they actually belonged to the tenant next door. What a very odd thing to have happen for both parties. I mean, could you imagine your landlord coming over and saying, "Hey, found your underwear draped across Jesus"? Be kind of a weird thing. Now, no one in the Moffat household could explain how these belongings had gotten inside their home. Now, despite everything that was going on, Bill Jr., he would rent out his property yet again, and this time to a young couple named Tom and Michelle. Now, the unusual activity seemed to have quieted down, at least at first. In fact, Bill would tell him, "This house, it might be haunted." Tom and Michelle would just kind of laugh it off. Days turned to weeks without anything happening. That was until one morning, Deborah found Michelle sitting on the doorstep. She was visibly shaken, sporting a few bruises on her face. Through the tears, Michelle would confess that Tom had been hitting her during an argument, something that he had never done before. In fact, she claimed that Tom's once fun-loving temperament had shifted very dramatically once they moved in. veering more so into like an anger and even aggression. Deborah urged Michelle to seek help, but the young woman refused. Then just a week later, Michelle vanished. When Deborah pressed Tom about her whereabouts, he claimed that they'd had a fight and she simply left him. No one knew where she had gone, or even why. Now, before long, Tom also disappeared. He packed his things and he abandoned the property without any kind of warning or explanation. When the Moffats would go and inspect their rental home and see what kind of things they had to fix before they had a new tenant move in, they were surprised to see that it was spotless. It's almost like it was scrubbed and sanitized. The weird thing is there was only really one thing missing: a large rug. They just dismissed it as the couple probably ruined it. And as they was leaving, because it was abrupt, he probably just threw it away. That assumption, it was shattered just a few days later. A stranger appeared on the driveway asking for Tom. Deborah explained that he was gone, he left. And that's when the man delivered a grim piece of news. Michelle, she'd been found dead, beaten to death, and wrapped in a rug. Her body discovered in a landfill. With that shocking revelation, the man left as quickly as he had arrived, never even identifying himself. Now, if the story was true, why didn't it surface in the newspaper or police bulletins? I mean, Bill Jr., he was an avid consumer of the daily headline. He found no mention of a murdered young woman in a landfill. He started wondering if this was a malicious prank, maybe a harrowing secret, or maybe it was something else entirely. Now, Deborah wanted to take the account to the authorities, but Lee, she refused. See, the family believed that Bill Sr., they thought that he was, back in the day, part of a Sicilian mafia. Going to the police, Lee insisted, was not an option. Frightened and conflicted, Deborah just relented, leaving the haunting possibility that a violent crime was now tied to the property, where unexplainable events had already taken root. By late 1987, the Moffat family, they'd seen enough. After months and months of strange activity occurring across the three adjacent homes. And we're talking about things like hearing crashes inside the home, missing objects, and hearing whispering voices. They decided it was time for a new start. Seems all of our stories always revolves around a fresh start. The plan was simple. They were going to sell all three properties and purchase one single larger home further up north. Their hope was that leaving would also mean that they could escape whatever was plaguing them. But on the very day they prepared to move, the unexplained became undeniable and terrifying. Deborah and Lee were packing up the final boxes, and they were doing it right in the middle of the room. They would hear a thunderous crash come from the kitchen. They would dash in to find all the cabinets had been ripped right off the walls and shattered on the floor, almost as though something with inhuman strength had pulled it right down and just shattered it. Moments later, they heard the sounds of breaking glass from the bedroom that they had just left. As they would run back, they saw that every window pane was cracked from the inside out. For Deborah, who had been somewhat open-minded about the possibility of it just being a playful spirit, she now found herself deeply entrenched in terror. She and Lee fled from the house, completely shaking in fear. Lee vowed never to step foot in any of those premises ever again. And it was a promise she'd keep. Now, despite the violent send-off, the Moffats, they made their move. Their new home, it was bigger. It was brighter. And it was uneventful. At least for the first few weeks. You see, the peace and the quiet, it was very short-lived. One morning, Bill Sr., he noticed a framed photograph on the mantle had been turned to face the wall. Lee tried to rationalize it as just a careless accident while cleaning, but the family knew better. They'd seen all of this kind of pattern before. Now, all of a sudden, people within the family began feeling that stress yet again. It started small. Oddly placed objects, a picture shifted overnight, but soon it all escalated. In the dead of night, the security alarm had started to blare unexpectedly, rousing them from their sleep. Each time they found no sign of forced entry and no explanation for what triggered the alarm. Then came the screams echoing from the upstairs halls, always jolting the family awake in a panic. They'd rush to find nothing. No intruder. No distressed neighbor. Only the lingering echoes of those screams. More unsettling still was the whispered voices. Sometimes while alone in a room, a family member would hear their own name, spoken softly in the darkness. Proof that whatever force had arrived with them was not only present, but it was aware of who they were. Deborah would be in a room by herself and she would hear, "Deborah." At first, Deborah would try to remain calm, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that the entity was growing bolder and more personal. Then came the final straw, the messages. One day, one of the Moffats walked into the bathroom and froze. Written in soap on the mirror were the words, "No escape." "Talk to me." These cryptic notes appeared again and again and again over the next few days, some threatening, others almost helpful. At times, the writing seemed to warn them of dangers, bad wiring, a problem in the attic. In other moments, it openly taunted them with the words like "fools." Especially chilling to Lee was seeing the nickname Nini scrawled across the glass, something only her late sister had ever called her. For a moment, she wondered if this was truly her sister's spirit. But just as it began to find comfort in the possibility, another message seethed with hatred. "I hate Lee." It was enough to drive Bill Sr. to demand that this unseen force identify itself. The next day, they got a response. One single word, left again with soap on the mirror. Prince. Now, whatever Prince was, the message was pretty clear. See, it had followed them, and now, in the second home, it claimed its territory as its own, watching, mocking, and even calling them by name. Prince. It was a name that invoked very sinister power, almost reminiscent of the phrase, "the Prince of Darkness." And it soon made its intentions painfully clear. Almost immediately after a local priest made a very half-hearted attempt to bless their new home, the entity, the aggression of it ramped up significantly. Messages and soap on the mirrors saying, "I hate Lee, Lee die." Targeting Bill Jr.'s mother with unrelenting malice. Floors were torn as if by claws. Ominous symbols would appear, including the same triangle shape that was once formed by the bobbleheads, with the triangle and then the line that would come off. It began appearing carved into wallpaper and into the floors. For Lee, the attacks, they become very personal. When it started attacking things like the crucifixes, she would find them broken or turned upside down. Statue of Jesus, previously intact, now lay on the floor with his head and his arms snapped off. Even after moving to lower floors for safety, Lee found the same messages waiting for her. See, the Moffats, they couldn't outrun the presence in their own home. A suffocating reminder of the warning once sprawled in the soap. No escape. Desperate for answers, they turned away from the church and they moved their interest to paranormal community, including psychics and investigators and research teams, and they asked them all to come into their home. One team claimed that the force was both powerful as well as ancient. If the Moffats had any doubt about its strength, their uncertainty vanished when activity began to spiral right into violence. What began as eerie messages on mirrors was now targeting the family, especially Bill Jr.'s mother Lee, with what appeared to be almost like booby traps, meant to injure and to terrorize. Lee first realized the gravity of the threat while seated at the dining room table. She felt something sharp scrape against her leg. Of course, this startled her as she would look down and find a kitchen knife partially hidden in the seat cushion, the blade angled upright. It was as though someone or something had deliberately jammed it there, waiting for a moment to strike. Knives began turning up beneath bed sheets, wedged into the upholstery, and planted in other places the family would sit or lie down. Always, it seemed, Lee was the intended victim. Imagine never knowing where you could sit down, never knowing what was going to happen when you sleep. Fear and exhaustion, it would take hold. Deborah found herself anxiously checking every piece of furniture before using it, and dreading the day that they might find Lee, wounded or worse. Yet even beyond the house, the family, they received no rest on vacations when they stayed in hotel rooms. The now familiar triangle symbol with the line, it would appear carved in the walls as if the entity was following them even there. Back at home, new disturbances would arise. Sporadic knocking from inside the cupboards, unsettling crow infestations, and bold rats that refused to flee even when discovered in the pantries. It was as if nature itself had become almost accomplices to whatever force was stalking the Moffats. At their wits' end, the family tried to open direct lines of communication, leaving messages on the same mirrors the spirit used. In one instance, they begged for relief from the rats, only to awaken and find the vermin inexplicably gone. For a moment, they dared to hope this meant some form of progress. But that little sense of relief soon evaporated as the entity found new ways to torment them. Now, the hauntings would go far beyond the house or even vacations. We're talking about they couldn't even go out and get a meal. They couldn't even go out to like a family outing. When they would return home, they would find souvenirs from their trips that they had not expected. We're talking about things like name badges or silverware, even scraps of food that was left behind where they ate. It would all be deposited back into the family's kitchen, almost as though it was proof that this entity, it was with them the entire time. It was just watching, preparing. But preparing for what? That's the question. If anything, Deborah clung to any chance of hope. She was even hoping that the faint possibility of help might come from the spiritual experts, in which there was some cases where that happened. In fact, they had talked to these Native American shamans, Deborah and Bill. They met with the shamans at a psychic fair and invited them to come cleanse the house. And the approach, it was very methodical. They would take bundles of sage that were lit. They would light it and they would let the smoke enter into the rooms, and they would walk around. But the moment that they reached the attic door, everything changed. As they would waft the smoke towards the attic door, which was open, they expected it to drift inside, but instead, it was forced back, almost as though it was repelled by an invisible force. The shamans, they exchanged very anxious glares back and forth at each other. Something powerful was up there, refusing to yield. Chanting quietly, they ascended into the dimly lit attic space, Deborah by their side. For a few tense moments, nothing happened. Then Deborah noticed the insulation in the rafters began to shift. Slowly, it contorted into an unmistakable shape of a giant skeletal face. A single horn came from where the ear should have been, and two deep hollows formed where the eye should have been. Horrified, Deborah and the shamans watched as the face stared back at them before collapsing into a heap of insulation on the floor. All three were left shaken. The shamans insisted that this entity, it was more dangerous than they had ever experienced and somehow connected to Bill Sr. Whether it was feeding on his energy or exerting control over him was unclear. They noted how Bill Sr.'s reaction to the disturbance could very swiftly swing from panic to total indifference. With the ritual somewhat of a stalemate, the shamans made one last desperate attempt. If they couldn't banish the presence, they could at least try to confine it. Now, according to Deb, they claimed that they transferred this negative spirit, this entity, this demon, whatever it may have been, into that of the body of the family dog. His name was Jeff. Now, that was an outcome that at best was unsettling. At worst, it was potentially catastrophic, especially for Jeff, who died of a chronic intestinal illness. Now, under any other circumstance, it might have just been seen as a tragic but natural end. But in this haunted house, some wonder if the dog's death was a byproduct of a failed attempt by Native American shamans to transfer the dark presence into the animal's body, like a vessel too fragile to hold it. With everything that was going on, family absolutely terrified. And in a house that should be a place of solace and comfort. But there was a new hope. In stepped an investigator the family later called Gary Kent. Initially regarded as an ally, Gary found that the entity's focus would shift more from the family to him. Within an hour of challenging the presence to show itself, he was struck in the head by a book that seemingly fell from the second-story balcony. From there, things would only continue to escalate. His belongings would oftentimes be found destroyed. And in one especially humiliating twist, the mirror messages that began mocking his private life, accusing him of having a terrible sex life, and ridiculing him even further. Gary's nights, they were almost as bad as Lee's. Knives appearing, sometimes thrown, aimed at where he slept. But the most unsettling event, it would occur one morning as everyone was sitting down for breakfast. Everyone heard this. It was almost like a bizarre, like a snipping noise that was in the air. Suddenly, clumps of Gary's hair floated down to the floor as though invisible scissors was cutting it right off of his head. Panicked, he bolted. This was his breaking point. Gary fled the property and stepped away from the case, leaving the Moffats to face the force completely alone. With Gary gone, the relentless attention went right back to Lee. Deborah and Bill Jr., desperate and fearful of Lee's safety, decided to bring in new help, this time a famous husband and wife paranormal duo. You probably know where I'm going with this. Their names, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Now at this point, Ed and Lorraine Warren, they were already household names in the paranormal community. Their cases, real and sometimes disputed, had become part of the modern folklore. The Moffat family, now at their wits' end, believed that if anyone could help them confront whatever this aggressive spirit was within their homes, it would have to be the Warrens. Lorraine, a self-proclaimed medium, began by roaming through the house, trying to sense whatever was inside the home. Afterward, she would talk to Deborah, Bill Jr., and the others, and told them they were dealing with an ancient demonic presence. Ed, a self-taught demonologist, then devised somewhat of a ritual intended to test the Moffat story and see if this dark entity would reveal itself. The entire family would gather in the front room as Ed performed a series of prayers and command intended to lure the presence forward. Now, according to Deborah, there was like a heaviness that settled over the room. But what truly terrified them was a sudden change in Bill Sr. Usually he was stoic, occasionally dismissive of the haunting. He began twisting his arm in an odd, almost like a contorted position. His back arched in a way that Deborah described, almost as though it was animalistic, and he stood, dragging one foot as if paralyzed, growling with a ferociousness that none of them had ever witnessed before. Snarling and barking, Bill Sr. lunged at Ed. In response, Ed held out what he claimed was a relic of the very cross on which Jesus was crucified, an object he believed would repel demonic forces. Bill Sr., he spat out threats, promising to bite off Ed's hand, devour his flesh, spit it all back in his face. Then, as suddenly as it all began, the aggression subsided. Whether that was due to the power of what Ed held in his hand, the power of prayer, or simply exhaustion, Bill Sr., he would revert back to his normal demeanor. Afterward, Ed announced that Bill Sr. had been momentarily possessed, and that the demon was ultimately linked to Lee. The Warrens urged the family to seek help from the church, yet the Moffats, they'd already tried and failed to bring the Catholic priest into their home. Undeterred, Ed contacted a friend who arranged for a priest to visit. Bill Sr., a staunch Catholic, refused to allow a Protestant minister through their doors, believing it might lead to some form of retribution against himself. Frustrated, the Warrens realized their hands were tied. Without the family's cooperation for a new blessing or exorcism, there was very little that they could do. Ed and Lorraine, they would leave California, and they would apologize that they could not resolve the Moffat's haunting, mostly because the Moffat family, at least Bill Sr., would not allow for the help. That would leave Deborah, Bill Jr., and the rest of the family on their own, yet again, face to face with whatever this force was. And of course, after Ed and Lorraine left, the haunting would focus right back again around Lee. There'd be invisible hands that would push her, strangle her, and on one occasion, nearly dragged her into the kitchen pantry. Red marks around her neck left no doubt that whatever force haunted their home had become physically dangerous. Desperate? Deborah stepped forward. She refused to call the presence Prince, opting instead to refer to it mockingly as Mr. Entity, an act of defiance. To protect her children and husband, she demanded that the entity keep its distance from them, but an unsettling message soon appeared, again on the bathroom door. I will not touch your children. I will not touch your husband. But Lee belongs to me. The entity's message then took an unexpected detour, riddled with references to 17th century France, a monastery of corrupt monks, and a sacrificed nun who allegedly escaped. According to the entity, Lee had been that nun in a past life, and it had pursued her across the centuries to collect a debt of blood. Whether true or an elaborate psychological manipulation, the story clearly served one purpose: to torment the family. As if to drive home its intentions, the entity left a chilling message on the mirror yet again. Lee will die in 10 days. Right on schedule. Lee fell gravely ill and was rushed to the hospital with pneumonia. She would survive, but for weeks remained under medical care. During her absence, paranormal activity at the home had subsided to only a few sporadic messages and misplaced objects. It soon became clear that Lee's hospital stay, it wasn't an escape from the haunting at all, it was just another battlefield. She would have disturbing visions, eerie visitations that suggested that Mr. Entity would not be denied, even beyond the walls of the Moffat family home. Though Lee would return home, she discovered slashed oxygen tubes and woke up to a creeping black stain that seemed to follow her through the house. At the same time, Bill Sr. grew even more distant, leaving Lee and the rest of the family to question his role in the ongoing nightmare. One night, Bill Sr., he woke up howling like an animal. Deborah found him upright in bed, his head arched back, eyes shut, snarling at the ceiling. As quickly as that all had began, he seemed to be snapped back to being awake, never fully explaining what had happened. Fearing possession, Deborah enlisted the help of a freelance exorcist named Stephen Blake. But even his attempt to clean the home seemed partially impossible due to the ancient presence. Eventually, Bill Sr. underwent a psychiatric evaluation. His confessions about the haunting led doctors to brand the story as simply delusional. But they would also begin to suspect that Lee was behind it all. Their accusations devastated her. With all of this going on, the tension between Lee and Bill Sr. it was at a whole new level. Their marriage was falling apart, which we typically see in these kinds of stories, and Lee, desperate for some type of relief in life, demanded that Bill Sr. leave. And he did leave in anger. As soon as he left, almost immediately, the aggression in the household, it lessened. No more violent outbursts. There was only a few ominous messages that was left on the mirror. With all that being said, shortly after, the elusive paranormal investigator Gary Kent, he returned, hoping that he was going to lure Mr. Entity away with him back to England. The entity, however, showed nothing but contempt for Gary, labeling him worthless. It did, however, leave one final message that they found on the mirror. It said, "Goodbye, my family." Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the haunting just flat out ended. Now, from 1987 to to 1992, the Moffats, they survived unspeakable, relentless fear and aggravation. And they very rarely spoke of it to anybody. Deborah, her husband Bill Jr., and Lee, they would oftentimes find themselves sleeping in the same room and refusing to discuss anything with anyone because, if anything, they didn't want to bring power to even summon something like that back into their lives. Only after Lee and Bill Jr. died in 2009 and 2012, respectively, did Deborah share the family's photos and personal accounts. Even more compelling is the testimony of Deborah's daughter, Jessica, who grew up in the house without understanding why her family was so strange and so fearful all the time. She recalls her grandmother desperately warning her never to mention ghosts. Her father needed to walk her down dark hallways. And the second floor, that was completely off limits. She wasn't allowed up there. She remembers those faint triangles scratched into plaster, symbols of a haunting she never witnessed, but she still felt lurking just behind every single door. In 2022, Jessica, she made the ordeal very public in an article to the Huffington Post, describing the stunning revelations and discovering old photographs, knives embedded in family portraits, cryptic messages on bathroom mirrors, evidence of destruction with no nearby explanation. It was a jarring insight into the years that her family hid in silence, haunted by the memories, if not by the entity itself. With that, I ask you a question. Was Mr. Entity the vengeful spirit of a centuries-old demon conjured by a misguided ritual? Was it potentially fueled by the family's secret and eternal strife? Or was it an elaborate hoax born of desperation and buried trauma? The answers, they remain tangled in decades of speculation and fear woven through one family's testimony. Yet the Moffat story, complete with torn carpets, cryptic symbols, vicious attacks, and final words scratched into the mirror, stands out as one of the most disturbing and puzzling hauntings in modern lore. For Deborah and her daughter, life moved on, but the echo of "Goodbye, my family" reminds us that some mysteries refuse to be fully laid to rest, and that the most chilling accounts don't always end up with a roar. Sometimes they end with a whisper. If you enjoyed this podcast and video, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Also, if you've not subscribed to the channel and you're still sitting here this long, maybe check out other stories I've told and hit that subscribe button. Also, let me know in the comments down below, what do you think really happened? Do you think the story's legit? Thank you so much for being here. Until I see you on the next video or podcast, goodbye.